So before we get into these core Catholic principles on how to vote as a Catholic in the political process, let's look at the scripture for a moment. The Pharisees hate Jesus, and we see how much they hate him because they are teaming up with some of their mortal enemies, the Herodians. These are the guys that are of the house of King Herod, and the ones who are working with the Romans. And so there's a certain hypocrisy here that they preach about not helping the Romans, not paying the census tax, and yet they're working with the Herodians, who actually are in league with Rome. And not only that, when Jesus asks them, after they're trying to entrap him, he actually entraps them by saying, "Show me a coin, a Roman coin that you're talking about." And one of them pulls it out, not realizing what he's doing, but what he's doing is he's showing his own hypocrisy, because they are preaching against paying taxes to Caesar, and they have taxes to give to Caesar. And that's one of the reasons why, they're pulling it out, and Jesus is like, look at your words and your actions. They're not lining up. And then we have this image here where it says, whose image is this? And whose inscription? The image was the image of Caesar. On the back, the inscription would say, the high priest, the great high priest, the one who was the mediator between God and man. So Caesar is taking his place that is Jesus's. And so they reply, Caesar's. Jesus then says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. So if his image is on it, well, give it back to him. Pay the census tax. But give to God what belongs to God. And where do we find God's image? If the Roman coin had Caesar's image, where is God's image? Us. We're made in the image and likeness of God. Which means everything about us, our whole being, belongs to the Lord. So do you see how he answers this, saying, yes, be able to be a good citizen, be able to, do those things for the just ordering of society, but make sure that you're doing it in a way that you're giving it to God first, because he owns all of you. And that's why, even in the political process, we're called to not sort of separate that and say, well, that's just something that's totally different than my faith. We're actually supposed to bring our faith into that, because that belongs to God too. And if we say, no, it doesn't, then what we're doing is we're saying, well, there's a part of me that doesn't have your image, God, and it doesn't belong to you. And sometimes what happens is we take our image that belongs to God and we give it to Caesar. So we give him everything instead of the area that maybe is due Caesar, the census tax, the areas of temporality. But we're not giving it first to God. So that's why we need to look at, from a Catholic perspective, that this political process, and even the whole idea of politics, nowadays it's kind of a dirty word. We think of corruption, we think of craziness, we think of, not the best of witnesses to the political process, but the word politics comes from a Greek word, polis, which means the city, the gathering together, society. And so to work in that area, in the political process, is to say, I care about my community. I'm not just an individual doing my own thing and, to heck with the rest of everything. But it's saying, I'm willing to work towards the just ordering of society. And most especially to protect and give security to those who are most vulnerable in our society. That's what it means to enter into the political process. So we need to rediscover that deeper understanding, even though it's lived out very poorly through many of the witnesses of our own political candidates right now. But it doesn't mean we need to throw the whole thing out and to say, well, I'm just not going to even deal with politics. Deal with it in the way of Christ. I care about my community. I want the just ordering of society. And it's a messy business, but if we don't jump into it, then in a sense we aren't in the fight bringing the gospel values there, and someone else is going to bring their own values. And so if you want the ordering society to be without Christ's image on it, then we step back. So that's why we have to actually engage this process. So here are 4 key principles to help you understand how to go into this process. And this comes actually from Bishop Robert Barron, taking Catholic social tradition and being able to articulate it very well. So you can actually go and find that on Word on Fire for the fuller article, but it basically is unpacking that particular article. The first principle, Catholic social teaching. So remember, social teaching means how do we engage society? How do we live the gospel in the community of mankind? Catholic social teaching goes beyond the split between liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat. If you feel fully aligned to one side or the other, and you feel totally comfortable in that, then that's actually a sign that there may be a blind spot that you're missing in the full Catholic social teaching. Archbishop Chaput would say, we are strangers in a strange land. We're sojourners in a strange land in the world of politics. We should feel uncomfortable, like we don't fit here or here. Now, it doesn't mean that maybe one of them at different times in history will maybe have a stronger connection to the Catholic social teaching in maybe greater areas, but we have to say that it goes beyond the split. And I'm going to do something right now that is going to make everybody uncomfortable, but that's all right. We can do that. I want to, broadly speaking, and this is what Bishop Robert Barron actually breaks apart here, is to say, looking at each of the 2 sides, Democrat and Republican, each one of them has certain themes that you'll find in the Catholic social teaching as a whole. Now, they might not always do it the best way, but the themes are there. And so a lot of times what we do is we spend a lot of times vilifying one another and saying, this is why you're bad, but let's first start and say, well, what are the things that we could say, well, that actually is in Catholic social teaching. We start with that first, and then we can then go into some of the hierarchy of values of saying, well, which ones have a more fundamental grounding there. So we're going to start with the Democratic Party. Now again, these are broadly speaking themes. Again, they don't always get things right on either side, but these are basic themes that you'll find that they generally espouse. So on the Democratic side, the liberal side, you have concern for the underprivileged, migrants, refugees, concern for the environment, opposition to capital punishment, and opposition to all forms of racism. Broadly speaking, that's generally what you find in some sort of way. On the Republican side, opposition to abortion, opposition to euthanasia, the defense of the traditional family, advocacy for conscience protection, the protection of the freedom of religion. Do you see how all of those things that I've said are all things that are part of the gospel? So if we sort of fall into what our media wants us to do, and to basically say, I'm fully aligned here or here, then what happens is we, in a sense, start to partialize the full social teaching. And this is actually one of the reasons why, if you've ever noticed, there is a hesitancy of endorsing particular candidates. And sometimes we say, well, that's because of tax-exempt status and stuff like that. It isn't really that. It's because there is historically a danger that when the church, in a sense, completely says, this is your person, then a lot of times what happens is we sort of gravitate and, in a sense, turn a blind eye to the areas that are not good in that particular candidate while supporting the things that are good. And we sort of close in and our Catholicism starts to look more like that particular political affiliation. And it actually takes away the authority of the church to be able to have that objectivity of being able to say, this is where you need to be converted, this is where you need to be converted. Do you see how when we say go this way or go this way, that we in a sense narrow in, and we're not able to see the areas that need conversion on both sides? Now, what this doesn't mean is just follow whatever your gut feeling is and just do it. The beautiful thing about these principles, and this is the second principle that's going to be coming up, is that the church doesn't endorse a particular candidate, but it also doesn't just step back and say it doesn't matter. And it gives principles to say there are certain themes, all of them are important, but there are certain themes that actually have a bigger priority and a much stronger weight. And you have to look at those things first, because if you don't have those things, then all the other goods of society don't matter. This is where the second one comes in. The second principle is that there has to be a priority given to the defense of human life. This is the most fundamental good of all. Because if you just think of it logically, if you don't have the right to your life, then what does it matter if you have a right to migrate somewhere? What does it matter if you have a right to have a job or have a better wage? All those things are good, and you shouldn't push them away, but if you don't have a right to life, then nothing else exists because you don't exist. And so this is an area which has been said over and over again is the fundamental area to look at when judging what should I do in these situations. And so you have three things that kind of come into this area in our current time. One of them is the area of abortion. One of them is the area of euthanasia. One of them is the area of capital punishment. Capital punishment in times past, there was a possibility for it when there was a society that didn't have the ability of containing an extremely dangerous criminal that could have created a mass destruction kind of thing. But in our particular age right now, John Paul II said this, Pope Benedict and Pope Francis said it even strongly, is that in our day and age, we don't have a society that we could justify a situation of capital punishment. And so that now comes into this area of what we call intrinsically evil things. Abortion has always been, euthanasia has always been, capital punishment is very much in that category now. So you have a situation in which you have a particular candidate that espouses very strongly two of those, but you have another candidate that espouses one of those. What you have to do in the midst of this is the question to be asked is not, well, which lives are more sacred? Because every single life is sacred. Sometimes that's a red herring when it says, well, you know, the unborn or the elderly or the poor or the migrant, and there's like battles over, well, who's more important? And it's like, I mean, just us right here. You know, if I say, well, this side's more important than this side, every single one is a child of God. So that's a red herring. All lives are equally sacred. But the question to be asked is, which of these groups of people are more direly and directly threatened? That's the key thing to ask. And I think it's very easy to look and to say, when you really look at this, every single one of them is wrong and intrinsically evil, but there's definitely one of them that seems to just grow in the amount of danger and the amount of direct attack, the thousands and hundreds of thousands in the area of the unborn. They seem to be more directly and direly threatened. So that's what you need to then take into this Catholic principle is that there's a priority that the defense of human life needs to be upheld. But then when you're dealing with situations that are very imperfect, well, where's the area that you limit the most evil? And do you see how this is kind of opening the door to be able to say, when you really look at it, the area of abortion seems to be such a core area to be able to look at that is very hard to sort of just push away and rationalize. The third principle: a Catholic may never vote for a candidate because that candidate supports a morally repugnant position. They can only vote for that person despite that support, and only because of considerations that are very, very grave that outweigh the threat and the danger of what they're voting despite of. So again, you have a situation of one espousing pro-choice situation, one espousing a pro-capital punishment situation. Both of them are wrong and intrinsically evil. So you could never vote for the pro-choice candidate because you want to further the women's right to choose. That actually would then enter into the area of sin. You couldn't vote for someone who was pro-capital punishment because you want that to happen. You would be entering into that area of sin. And so, in order for someone to vote in a particular way, you have to be willing to go back and say, in truth and in full honesty, even though this is a flawed, morally repugnant position, I vote for this person despite of this because there is a greater evil on this side. And you have to be able to rationalize and really, really understand that. That's one of the other principles that's there. The fourth principle: Catholics ought never to disagree in regard to moral principles, but they can legitimately disagree about the best means to instantiate those principles, to actually find the means to live them out. So again, this is different than intrinsically evil principles. You can never find a good way of intentionally killing an innocent person. There isn't a more humane way or a better way of doing it. That's always wrong in every situation. So these principles, though, are things where, in principle, you can never be against, but there are different means to that end. So, for instance, you can never be against the protection of the environment. I mean, you can't, unless you're like a villain or something, it's like, I want to destroy the entire Amazon rainforest just because it's fun. Like, I want to pollute the Fox River just because I want to make people miserable. Like, who does that? Like, you can't be against the protection of the environment. You can't be against serving the poor. You can't be against defending the traditional family. This might be a little more difficult one, because what that means is I stand by the truth that marriage is a lifelong covenant of love between one man and one woman. That's what is being said there. So in principle, you can't go against that, or you're actually going against the gospel. You can't be against battling social injustice. You can't say, I want social injustice to reign. You can't be against freedom of liberty, freedom of conscience. Do you see how there's principles there where you can't go against those? But there can be different ways that you can disagree on about how to attain those ends. So you can disagree on the legitimacy of offshore drilling, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. The reform of healthcare, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? The level of minimum wage, how to reform the immigration system, how to serve the poor. There are different ways and different means to do that, and some of them might be better than others, but you still can follow your conscience in a prudential judgment to say, I feel like this is the best way to serve the poor. You can't say, I'm just against serving the poor. So these are the four basic principles to help you understand. Again, this is not just for this election, this is for every single election that's there. This could be for Reagan, this could be for Clinton, this could be for Obama, Bush, whoever. this is how you, in a sense, take those principles. You allow the Holy Spirit to lead you and guide you, and this is what you call a well-formed conscience. So you're supposed to vote according to a well-formed conscience, not just a conscience that whatever you want to do. Now, the final thing here is there is a legitimacy of two ways of voting. One is you have two imperfect, strong candidate possibilities. Both of them are very, very flawed in different ways. So one way of approaching is, how do you limit a greater evil? That's one way of voting. You may, in the midst of your discernment, look at both of the sort of main candidates and say, there is too much moral flaw here in their positions, in their character, that in my conscience, I can't vote for either of them. That's what you call third-party vote. You might say, well, that's just wasting the vote. But if in your conscience you are truly looking and saying, both of these won't be able to ultimately bring the just ordering of society, if I vote in a certain way for someone who has a much stronger platform, even though they might not win this election, but if I can help them to grow so that ultimately the other areas start to get curbed and become a little more balanced in the middle, that is actually a legitimate way of voting. So both of those ways, in the midst of prudence and what's happening within your conscience and weighing all these things, you have those particular ways of voting in this situation. So again, this is Catholic teaching. This is how to be able to apply these principles to be able to be a Catholic in the voting process. So God bless you. I hope this was helpful just to kind of dig into this and to give you a little bit of substance of how do I as a Catholic actually enter into this voting process.